Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Okay, that's awesome. I'm actually a little bit nervous, not about talking about snakes, but the technical setup here. I'm actually streaming onto YouTube via Livestream, so all the technology is down to me. So if I mess it up, it's a technical glitch on my part. Okay, so I can see Barbara, T&J Reptiles. I can see Celtic Reptiles. I can see Joe Tully. I can see Samantha. Hello, everybody. Oh, and I see Robert Whittier from Coach's Royal Reptiles. We've got somebody from the Philippines. Hello, Rodrigo. Many of these names I recognize. Erica, good morning. Okay, so I'm going to kick this off with a little bit more on ALS complexes. I did mention on my live stream over at the Holdback Racks that I enjoyed working with ALS, and that I've noticed that in ALS combinations that sometimes you don't get exactly 50-50 in terms of which gene is passed on to the offspring. And so I went right back to cellular level genetics and looked at the process of gamete production. So I'm just going to get my pipe cleaners out here and try to walk you through this process. So our ball pythons have 18 chromosomes from one parent and 18 chromosomes from the other parent. And these are called homologous pairs. So every single chromosome that a ball python receives from the father has an exact same chromosome from the mother. So we have 18 pairs of chromosomes. 17 of them are what we call homologous. They are exactly the same. Only the XY chromosome, which determines sex, is different. So I'm going to look and demonstrate an ALS combination, and we're going to look at one single chromosome, and I'm going to say that this is cinnamon enchi. So this is the chromosome on which the locus for cinnamon enchi actually resides. So it doesn't really matter which parent gives which gene for this demonstration, but you can see this is the homologous pair of chromosomes, one of which contains enchi and one of which contains cinnamon. So this is our cinnamon enchi allelic combination. Normally, when a cell divides, each of these chromosomes simply duplicates itself. So this chromosome on this side would duplicate its, I'm trying to get this in screen now, would duplicate itself, and we would get an exact copy of the cinnamon bearing chromosome. This chromosome would duplicate itself, and we would get an exact copy of that chromosome containing the enchi genetic mutation. And normally these would split and pair up again in a process known as mitosis to produce an exact copy of itself. And this is how a snake grows. The same snake will always reproduce cells which are identical to the original cell. However, in gamete production, what happens when the original chromosomes duplicate. We don't want an exact copy of mum or dad. We want something which is unique to be passed on to the offspring. So we have actually duplicated each chromosome. So we've got four. We've got four chromosomes now. These two are identical and these two are identical. And they line up within the cell, which gives an opportunity for some genetic material to jump between the various chromosomes. So you might get a little bit of this chromosome jumping across to this one, a little bit of this chromosome jumping across to this one. And what you end up with are four chromosomes which are actually unique. They are not the same as the chromosome from the sire or the dam. And when they split into four haploid cells, we're going to produce four sperm cells or four egg cells. And you can see that we now have four haploids, two of which must contain cinnamon and two of which must contain enchi. So the process of meiosis is actually quite simple and straightforward, and we will get a 50-50 split during sperm or egg production. So if we are seeing a bias in our offspring, something else is happening to control that. It could be statistical bias. It could be a bias in the way that we keep our snakes, so that one gene, maybe cinnamon or maybe enchi, is actually a little bit more sensitive to temperature. And some of the sperm survives better than other sperm. And so when the eggs are fertilized, you get a bias because of the way you actually keep your snakes. I'm not 100% certain on that. But meiosis is certainly well understood, and it's a fairly simple process. So having thought about that, the actual cell division process that produces sperm and eggs is going to give us 50-50 in our ALS combos. Something else is happening that affects whether we get a cinnamon or an enchi in the offspring, or depending upon what ALS combo you're working with, which of the offspring will have one gene and which of the offspring will have the other. So definitely more to say on that, but it is getting down to the nitty-gritty of cellular level genetics. So I just wanted to clear that up for those of you that did see my live stream on the holdback rack, because I did mention there is a bias I've noticed in ALS combos. Let me see if I can read some of the comments here. So feel free guys to actually ask questions. The demonstration is always easier when you actually use visual aids instead of trying to explain it in words. I think everybody likes the pipe cleaner videos from Mr. DNA. So, Joe, are you still here? Does that give you more to think about? Yes, Robert, you burnt your toast this morning. What's my favorite morph? Goodness me. I'm not sure whether you actually mean morph is simply a morphological variation, and that could include a single gene, or it could include a combination of genes to produce a snake which is a certain combination. So for instance, Iron Man. I think one of my favorite genetic complexes at the moment has to be spider, but not specifically the spider gene. Specifically, it would include spot nose, cypress, and all the other genes in the spider complex, not spider itself. And I enjoy working with that complex. And some of the ALS combinations that you can make, that would include blackhead as well, which I'm really enjoying working with at the moment, and putting those into recessive combos. So yeah, Iron Man as a morph, the leopard enchi ODYB clown, that has a great deal of potential. I'm obviously working with spot nose and would like to produce Pompeiis, but not just to copy a Pompeii, but to produce my own twist on a Pompeii, with some different genes. And again, I'd be looking at some of the spot nose complex, let's call it the spot nose complex rather than the spider complex. And some of those genes are actually quite dark. So you could replace black pastel in your Pompeii, excuse me, with a different gene that is actually part of the spot nose complex. So you could kill two birds with one stone, and then perhaps put an allelic combination in with perhaps cypress. And then, of course, putting DG into everything. DG makes everything better. Yeah, Robert, I think there might be a statistical bias there because our sample sets are quite small. But given what we know about gamete production and meiosis, there has to be an equal number of cinnamon sperm and angiosperm from the male. And similarly, if it was a female, cine eggs and enchi eggs from the female. So I'm not sure what's going on. Yes, it's a real phenomenon. Yes, there is a bias. I think we need to look to some other mechanism to explain why we're getting that bias. Yes, Fire Vanilla, Joe. Fire Vanilla is another one. I have struggled to produce a vanilla scream or a vanilla cream, which is the Fire Vanilla combination. And I always seem to end up with getting a ton of vanillas and not enough fires. Cine Enchi, again from Robert, Coach's Royal Reptiles. He's noticed the same bias in Cine Enchi. Spider, when I have worked with some of the allelic combinations with spider, so say spider cypress, and produce offspring from that, I've seen videos where people get more cypress than spider or more spider than cypress. And I've also seen clutches where they've been almost entirely spider and nothing of the other gene. Are there any markers for het albino? I work lavender more than I work albino. Excuse me. And I have noticed that the het lavenders tend to be a lot brighter and hold their color better than their non-het siblings. So if you're working with a het to het pairing and you're getting pos hets, it's going to be the bright ones that you look for. I think if you can do it, always use a visual on one side, and then you're guaranteed that you're going to get 100% hets, but that's not always possible. So certainly in lavender albinos, I would be looking for the brightest ones. A gene to avoid or dislike? None of them really. It depends on your sensitivities. Spider gets a lot of hate because of the supposed neurological issues, but we now know better than that. It's not a neurological issue. It's a deformity of the inner ear, and it applies to actually most of the spot nose complex to varying degrees. So when you double up and make the super spot nose, you often get a snake that wobbles. Super cinnamon, super cypress is the same. Obviously, super spider and super champagne are so bad that they can be lethal, and we never actually see the super form. Theoretically, they do exist, but they usually die in the egg. So I would avoid combos that are known to be genetically lethal. But apart from that, I don't actually see that spiders, because it's highly variable, spiders actually do tend to thrive in our captive setting. And the spider gene was actually imported from the wild. So there was an adult spider living in the wild quite happily that was carrying the spider gene. It's not related to just snakes and the spider gene. Actually, a lot of animals where we line breed for color mutations, for physical shape, as in dogs, very often you do get an associated inner ear deformity. It's not unique to snakes, it's not unique to reptiles. It's actually common in many of our fancier breeding projects for any animal. So why we've singled out the spider gene in the reptile community is actually, well, I don't understand it. It's non-scientific. Actually, the super spider, ARP has created a super spider which did survive for several months and then died, and it wasn't actually a white snake. It was a very reduced spider with very high white sides. I'll send you a photograph of it, Joe. It did survive for a few months, but it did eventually pass away. And yes, it had a wild wobble, but not necessarily a white snake. I suspect that if a snake dies in the egg because it's actually a lethal superform, it forms its color and pattern at a very late stage during the egg development. So if you have an egg die, you cut into the egg and you think, this is what the superform should look like. It's a white snake because it hasn't actually formed its color and pattern yet. And that's why we tend to think of a lot of these lethal combos as being white snakes. I don't actually think they are. If they went full term, they would develop some color and pattern. Yep, you can combine the spider with other genes, and I have noticed that careful selection of spiders, you can actually reduce it, but you can't eliminate it completely. I've bred several spiders that don't wobble, and some of the offspring do. I've bred a spider that had a really bad wobble, and some of its offspring didn't. And I'm not certain that it's to do with combining it with other genes. The other genes would reside on perhaps different chromosomes, certainly on a different locus. And yes, we now know that some of our genetic mutations are polygenic, and some of the other hidden genes associated with our more common morphs do actually affect the visual appearance and presumably the inner ear deformity in spiders. So it is possible, but I don't have any additional information on that. There is a scientific paper that describes the inner ear deformity on spiders and looked at several populations of spiders that showed a highly variable degree of wobble. So to say that all spiders wobble is not true. What it is that we need to do to reduce that wobble, I'm not certain that it's entirely predictable, but yes, I've noticed that a lot of ARP spiders from selective line breeding over the years are actually quite good. I have a bumblebee calico, which is a phenomenal looking snake. It's a female, it's up to breeding size, and that has no hint of a wobble at all. Does that mean its offspring won't wobble? I'm not certain on that. I have had spiders that don't wobble produce offspring that do. Yeah, I think many people like the spider gene, Robert. One of my first ball pythons was a spider as well. And they all thrive. I don't treat them any differently. They don't need any special treatment. They eat, they shed, they poo. They do everything that my other ball pythons do. I think where people run into problems with spider is that they are susceptible to stress. When their corticosteroid levels go up due to stress, that would include handling, that would include husbandry, which is not quite up to scratch, keeping them in a glass aquarium with all glass sides and nowhere to hide is guaranteed to make a spider wobble and put it off food as well, as it would with most ball pythons. So I do think that the reason that most successful breeders don't have trouble with spider is because their husbandry is actually quite stress-free, and their spiders therefore thrive along with all their other all their other snakes, they don't treat them any differently, and indeed mine don't get treated any differently to any other, and they have no trouble striking. They don't miss, they don't sulk in a corner and turn upside down. Most of my spiders are actually quite normal. Is there a gene that's difficult to work with? All genes are the same and they work in the same way. You can have the heterozygous form, you can have the homozygous form, and it's the odds of hitting those combinations that change. So when you work with a specific gene, no, you're going to get 50% of the babies will have that gene. There might be some polymorphic variation in the visual expression, but generally speaking, you'll get, if you breed a pastel, you'll get 50% of the babies will be pastel, and they'll all look pretty much the same, like a standard pastel. When you try to create a super pastel, then the odds increase. So breeding a pastel to a pastel is 1 in 4. So a super form, an ALS combo, and a homozygous recessive have exactly the same odds. They're exactly the same difficulty of creating them. Where the difficulty creeps in is in our multi-recessive projects, where you're trying to create the super form of several different genes all at once, and the odds go 1 in 4, 1 in 16, 1 in 32, 1 in 64. So it's exponentially difficult to hit those genetic combinations. What do I feel about scaleless? You need to ask Joe about that. Scaleless, I think you need to be a little more careful with husbandry, and I'm not sure it's to do with, traditionally people say they need to be kept more humid, and to most people that means damping down the substrate and keeping them on damp substrate. To me, humidity is something that should be in the air, not in the substrate. So for instance, in our environment, Samantha, where humidity is 80–90% at 30 degrees centigrade, and remember, humidity is relative to temperature. The warmer the temperature is, 90% humidity at 10 degrees centigrade is not the same as 90% humidity at 30 degrees centigrade. There's a lot more carrying capacity in the air with higher temperatures. So for me, the tropics, the natural tropical environment with our naturally high humidities would be the perfect place to keep a scaleless. And you would keep it as dry as you possibly could, just as we do with our other snakes. We don't want any condensation. We don't want any bacterial growth. The humidity comes from the air. Now, I know Joe has actually reduced the feedings on his scaleless because sometimes they will have difficult sheds. And it depends on your, again, depends on your climate and where you're keeping them. If you slow down the shedding process, then you alleviate some of the problems over their husbandry and keeping them. But is that just bypassing the problem? So scaleless, yes, it does produce some very interesting color variations and pattern variations to the non-scaleless counterpart. But I would say that scaleless, it's not something that ARP has it, but we haven't produced any scaleless yet. I don't, and I'm not going to try, but if ARP does, it will be very interesting to see if our natural tropical climate is more conducive to keeping scaleless than, say, in a temperate climate where you're forced to use artificial heat and therefore you're constantly chasing humidity and other parameters. So it'll be interesting to see. I'm not. I'm also trying to reduce the amount of spider in my collection simply from a commercial aspect. Spiders are just not as popular. And if they don't sell and you have a bunch of spiders in your collection, ARP again sells a lot of spiders. They're very, very popular out here in Southeast Asia. It doesn't carry the same stigma for some reason as it does in perhaps the UK, where people hate on it and it's banned from shows. Out here in Southeast Asia, spiders are actually very popular, and they're an essential morph. It's very difficult to replicate some of the morphs you can make with spider any other way. So, for instance, we do have spider versions of Iron Man, the leopard, Enchi, orange dream, yellow belly clown. We have put spider into that, and ARP has called it Venom. And it's an awesome looking snake. It really is a very pretty snake. So, yeah, mixed feelings on spider. Part of it is peer pressure and the stigma, and paying attention to what other people say rather than just doing my own thing, which is probably bad. Thanks, Smay Serpents. Yes, go hit the like button. It does help. And that must be Jessica, Holdback Rack Podcast. She's here. Yeah, Erica. They're also carpet pythons. The jungle jags also have issues. You can be lucky and not have issues with them. And again, I think that's exactly the same problem as with spider. It isn't a neurological issue that's genetically passed on to the offspring. It's simply a function of during embryo development, when proteins and hormones are switched on and off by the genes, because of the color and pattern mutations having a close association with formation of the inner ear, however unlikely that might sound, it's a similar problem. And the expression is variable. It will vary from snake to snake. Not all of them have it. And it could pop up again from a perfectly good snake. Hi, D&K Reptiles, Derek from Colorado. My goodness. Tags Pythons. Hi, mate. Where are we on DG? Okay. I've produced my first ever clutch of visual DGs from a straight DG to DG pairing. But before I did that, I produced a whole bunch of double het DG clowns, which are now 2.5 years old and about ready for pairing. At the same time, and that included a breeder loan from ARP, I should add. So half of those double hets were his. He also produced a bunch of double het DG hypos and DG pies. So we've got all of those projects now approaching the stage where we're going to have our first shot at producing the double recessive. So DGs, yes, we're already producing DGs. I beat ARP to it, and I made the first clutch of visual DGs in this part of the world, at least. But he does have plenty of DGs, and some of that clutch of offspring. I already have, for instance, a yellow belly DG. That was the female that I used, and I produced a yellow belly DG female. So he will get that. There's no point me keeping it. And when he gets a visual DG with different genes, we'll just swap it out so that we can mix and match. So the association that I have and the close relationship I have with ARP definitely speeds things up. We can work together rather than work in competition. If he has a particular snake that he doesn't want to put on the market because he doesn't want to fall into enemy hands, he can always pass it to me, because effectively that means it stays in-house and we're not giving other breeders a leg up on a lot of the hard work. By hard work, I mean the generations it takes to produce the hets and the double hets. If you sell those off and somebody realizes what they have, they're basically skipping 2 or 3 generations, 2 or 3 years, and they're producing something which is highly valuable using your hard work. Generally speaking, people don't want to pay for that. So when you sell off your hets, they don't want to pay for the het. They don't want to pay for the hard work. Do I breed any other reptiles? No. In the past, I have. I've done a few frogs, toads, especially when I was a kid. Mostly mammals, actually. I had a cat that had a litter of kittens. I've had hamsters, mice, rats, of course. But reptiles, no. Ball pythons are I guess my thing. Ooh, wow, Smay Serpents. If I had to pick only 3 single gene morphs to work with for the rest of my life, what would that be? Well, okay. If I'm going to pick 3 single gene morphs, it would have to be with a specific visual look in mind. And depending upon the project I chose, it would actually be 3 different genes. So for instance, I have just produced clutches of Orange Dream Yellow Belly that have vanilla thrown into them. And I've been very impressed with what vanilla does to Orange Dream. And so that would be 3 simple genes that you could work with to produce some really nice snakes: Orange Dream, Yellow Belly, and vanilla together. Fire's an obvious one. Orange Dream and fire also work very well together, as you would expect. If vanilla works, then fire's going to as well. 3 single genes. Now I'm hard pressed. I wouldn't like to be restricted to 3 single genes. Orange Dream and Black Pastel work really well together. Orange Dream and Leopard work really well together. So it just depends on what visual look you're going for as to what 3 genes you would choose. And thank goodness I don't have to make that choice. But I've given you a few there: fire, vanilla, Orange Dream, Yellow Belly, Leopard. Spot Nose would be another one. So pick 3 of those. I could work with that. Is it true that sheds for hypos is clear? I have a chocolate NGDG hypo, but I think it's a double visual. Okay, so you're this is Cuddle Time Critters here. This comment here. I haven't noticed with hypo that the sheds are clear. I do have a visual leopard hypo. I'll have to have a look next time, but I do think it has a ghost pattern. I think your question here is, can you tell if you have a visual as opposed to a het? If you're not sure whether you're looking at a visual hypo, can you tell from the shed? Well, you could certainly tell from the shed if you sent it off for genetic testing, but that's not. You could also tell by breeding it, I suppose. But in terms of the shed, no, I haven't noticed that the visual hypo is actually clear. I think it would depend upon the genetic combination. So, for instance, leopard hypo. Leopard is a very powerful gene, and it's always going to show through. It's always going to put pattern back. It's always going to do something to morphs which traditionally are plain snakes. So, for instance, a leopard ivory, the super yellow belly will be a white snake, but you put leopard in there and it makes a fantastic multicolored snake. So leopard you can always see, and I'm guessing that in your hypo, if you had leopard in there, you would be able to see leopard in the shed. There would be a ghost pattern, yes. I'll have to check that. Interesting. There you go, Smay Serpents. All my hypo ghost sheds are clear, so that possibly helps. Do I have a dream project? They're all dream projects. I spend a long time dreaming about them all. I think working with DG, as soon as I get a double recessive, whether it be DG Clown or DG Hypo, DG Clown in particular is of great interest to me. I think that DG really enhances the look of the clown. Other double recessives, Dreamsicle, ARP produced some really nice Dreamsicles. Since he's done it, I don't need to bother. What else? I'm going to be controversial again here. Double recessive projects. Clown pieds, waste of a double recessive. A clown pied is nothing but a pied with a clown head. What a waste of a double recessive. How's that, guys? Is that controversial? What are the best genes to work into champagne? Okay, again, champagne being in the spider complex, and we know that super champagnes is a lethal combo. So you don't want to work anything in the spider complex into champagne. So whilst they may not be lethal, I would still avoid spot nose. I would avoid cypress. Blackhead would probably work okay, but the genes that have the biggest impact on a champagne are leopard and enchi. They will put pattern back every time. I have a leopard champagne which has a fantastic pattern. ARP has made enchi champagnes, and he's made leopard enchi champagnes, and they have a lot of pattern. Champagne is a powerful gene and tends to overpower just about everything that you could mix it with, but you can put pattern back using leopard and enchi. Erica, what's a super chat? Let me check on that. I'm not sure that I can do that with lives. I think I have a super chat on my normally on my my usual videos, but live streams I'm not sure. Robert, clown pied. Why? Because basically what you get with a clown pied is you get a pied with the head of a clown. So the clown has no influence at all on the rest of the snake other than just the head. And so to me, since there are other ways of producing a very similar looking, I don't like pies with dark heads, which they all have. But you can mix, for instance, cypress or other genes with pies to give them a lighter colored head. So it doesn't look like two snakes. Pies tend to be a really bright body and then a dark head. So it looks like they're two separate snakes, but you can change that with some fairly simple genetics. Clown for me, number one, it's recessive, so it's harder to get in there. And number two, it doesn't change the look of the pied enough for me to think it's actually worth the effort. I can do it with an incomplete dominant rather than a recessive. So to me, a clown pied is just a pied, and it has a fancy looking head, which I can get any number of ways. What do I do when it gets a ring of stuck shed on the tip of its tail? Typically what I find when a snake has problems shedding, and it's quite rare out here in the tropics, is that instead of it peeling off in a complete sock that's rolled up, it tends to come off very, very bitty. And what I do then is that I will basically wet the tub for 24 hours, wet the tub until it's completely shed, and then refresh the tub and put it back. It doesn't tend to happen at certain times of the year with differences in climate. It happens with different snakes at different times, and sheds are controlled by hormones. There's a certain sequence of events that occurs when a snake sheds, and sometimes I think a snake has problems because the hormone cycle is not quite as it should be. So a snake that sheds perfectly well every single time, all of a sudden for some reason doesn't shed, and you haven't changed its conditions or anything. And that, I think that's down to the snake's individual hormones. So yeah, you help it out with a bit of increased humidity. You can soak it, but I just tend to pour a bit of water in the tub and leave it sitting there for 24 hours and then clean its tub out in the morning, and that generally does the trick. Most of the early sheds of hatchlings tend to be clear. Not sure about that. Again, I'll have to check, because most of my sheds actually come out rolled up like a sock. So in order to have a look and see whether they are actually genuinely clear, I'd have to unroll them. Now, I have done that with some of my DG hatchlings. Because there's one of the universities here is starting to develop genetic testing for ball pythons. I have supplied sheds to that university lab, and so Generally, I give them rolled up like a sock, but I don't think that's actually true. I think that my sheds do have some pattern. You have to look very closely for it, but it would depend on the morph, I suppose. But I would guess that the darker morphs, like some of the cinnamons that I have, would certainly have different coloured sheds to some of the lighter morphs. But again, interesting point. I'll have a look at that. I can't say I've really noticed. And most of that is because my sheds don't come out unwrapped. They're usually like rolled up socks. So I tend not to waste too much time looking at them. Sorry. Yes, Enchi in a clown pied to see anything. Enchi in your pieds will, again, Enchi tends to give the snake less white and more pattern. That's not always the case. It's highly variable, but in general, Enchi will give you more. Fire tends to give you less. Leopard gives you a lot less. Sometimes when you put leopard into pied, all you get is a coloured head with a white snake. So it depends on the gene stack, but yes, you can also line breed your pieds. And again, ARP has a line of pieds which are just straight pieds that for some reason have absolutely no white on them at all, other than perhaps a little ringer at the tail that looks like a non-pied that's trying to be a pied, except the pattern is pied and the belly is pure white. So these things have been bred back to each other, and yes, they are pieds. They produce pieds, but they have no white. Yes, I'd agree with that, Robert. Visual pieds, it can be quite hard to manipulate what you get in a pied. And if the snake is all white with just a black, just a coloured head, I prefer my pieds to have a lot more pattern, because that's what you can change. That's what you can influence. You can't influence the white bits. You can only influence the pattern bits. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about humidity here. Robert's pointed out that bad sheds can be a dehydrated snake, not all humidity. Now, I'm going to tell you that because of a snake's physiology, we tend to think of animals needing to drink to be hydrated. Snakes' physiology means that they don't have a bladder. Their kidneys excrete directly into their GI tract, into their into their colons, which basically reabsorbs all the moisture. So, for instance, when your snake has a poo, I often see people, inexperienced people on Facebook, and they'll see a poo and it's got some white bit at the end of it. Well, the white bit's the urates, and that's the product of the kidneys. But all the moisture has been reabsorbed in the colon of the snake, and it has a common exit in the cloaca. So both the pee and the poo, and the pee tends to be in the form of urates rather than liquid, although snakes do produce liquid pee as well. But just as in, I'm going to be gross here, survival, if you have a fouled water source and you cannot purify the water, you can give yourself an enema and you will reabsorb some of the liquid through your colon. Snakes are also very adept at doing that. So when your snake sits in its water bowl, it can absorb water through the cloaca and the digestive tract. It does not need to drink it through its mouth. Likewise, in high humidity environments, where a snake is in an environment that has plenty of humidity in the air, you will find they don't drink anywhere near as much as they would if they were in a drier climate. So, yes, it's a dehydrated snake, but just remember, there are more ways than one of rehydrating your snake. Yeah, Samantha, if it's got a little indent on its tail, if for instance it has a slight kink, that will be a cause of problems in shedding. So worthwhile, as the shed comes off and rolls down the tip of its tail, if it's got a little kink, it'll get stuck as it rolls off, and sometimes it will tear, and you will end up with a small piece of shed at the base of the tail. Again, just soak it off, up the humidity. More often than not, it will shed just fine. If you have trouble, it probably isn't the shed, it probably isn't a dehydrated snake, it's probably just a little kink or some sort of glitch on the tip of its tail that's just catching that last little bit of shed. Yep, electrolyte soaks. Again, if your snake is, you can put sugar, you can put salt in water, and sometimes for minor prolapses, for instance, where some of the GI tract has prolapsed, a little bit of salt or sugar in the water that you soak your snake in will actually have the snake naturally withdraw that prolapse. That's only in minor prolapses. Often that won't work. Yeah, Erica, it happens. That one particular ball python that you have that has bad sheds, you may need to make some special precautions for that snake during the time that it sheds. Just bump up its humidity. You don't want to do it all the time. You only want to do it when it's shedding, because extra humidity, particularly if you have to mist or wet your substrate, is not a good thing. That encourages bacteria. I'm lucky in that I don't seem to have any snakes that have that consistent problem. Every once in a while a snake will have a bad shed, but it's not related to one particular snake. And our tropical climate is very conducive to not actually having to do a great deal to get the snakes to shed perfectly. So for that one particular snake, yes, you might need to give it some special attention, but only for the time that it goes into shed. You don't want to keep it wet all the time. Yeah, babies in the same tub in the incubator. Again, I'm quite lucky because my incubator runs at a temperature not much warmer than my actual snake room. So when my babies hatch, depending upon what I'm doing and what time I have, I tend to put mine into a tub in the snake room. But they all stay together until they shed for the first time. Eric, you get bored and unroll them. Once you get 50 or 100 snakes, you won't be unrolling the sheds. Yes, Robert, I know you're in the desert. Yes, but isn't it amazing that despite the fact that the snakes are from a tropical climate and their environment is one of the most stable on the planet, they are actually adaptable enough to be able to keep them just about anywhere, provided that you pay attention to the basic needs of temperature and humidity. If you get that right, the snakes will thrive. Yeah, I'm just looking at some of these comments about bad sheds and what you can do. It very much depends on how much time you have. Sometimes when I'm cleaning, if a snake has had a bad shed, I'll maybe stick it in a tub of water while I clean the rest of the snakes. And then at the end of that, I will put it back into its tub. Generally, I don't, because I just tend to wet the tub. But you can also use a damp pillowcase. If you wet a pillowcase and put the snake inside the pillowcase, it will slide around inside the wet pillowcase and it will rub off its own shed in about 20 minutes. That's another thing that you can do. Okay, Rodrigo, yes. I keep my tubs as dry as possible for most of the time, but it is absolutely unavoidable when you are pairing your snakes, particularly in the early stages of the breeding season where your snakes are still eating. They haven't gone off food. The first thing the snakes will do when you put them together is pee and poo. And no, it doesn't do them any harm for the duration of the pairing. Obviously, I would clean the snakes out afterwards. You don't want your snakes to be sitting for days at a time in a damp environment. But the pee and the poo is actually full of pheromones that encourage the breeding. So it's very difficult to avoid that. Typically, once your females go off food, when their follicles have grown to a certain size, when you introduce the male, they still pee. They don't poo anymore because their digestive tract's empty, but they still pee. And that's important from a pheromone perspective. You don't need a dirty tub to breed snakes. You don't want them sitting around in a dirty tub for too long, but just for a short period, it does them no harm at all. What's my opinion on ringers? Ringers are, I've noticed that ringers tend to be very common with certain genetics. So for instance, leopard combos often have ringers. What else would have? Champagne combos often have ringers. So something is going on with some of those gene combinations that produce ringers. And is it related to pieds? No, not always. A leopard ringer, people used to say that leopard was always het for pied. Back in the day, all leopards were het pieds and they had ringers, and that was telling you they're het pieds. We now know that's not true. Leopard is not intimately associated with pied. It's a completely separate gene, and you can get ringers without any association with pied at all. But is that actually true on a polygenetic level? Are there some genes within the gene pool that those particular snakes have that don't necessarily express, but actually produce the ringer? I'm not sure. No, Erica, it's not. You, you don't need to do that. Oh, D&K reptiles, Derek. Rob, what's my view on this one? Okay, this is a great one. Yes, I am very definitely in that camp. What happens when you feed your snake is that its metabolism goes sky high. All its organs expand and its oxygen uptake increases. So effectively, its metabolism has gone into afterburner. If you feed your snakes every week, it's constantly in full afterburner. Its metabolic rate is very, very high. And I do actually think that that can potentially shorten the lifespan of our snakes. So as a general rule, I am feeding my snakes bi-weekly or even less frequently than that. In the off season, when the snakes are not breeding, I will often not feed them for a month. The males don't get fed for a month. Females, depends how big they are, but I have no issue whatsoever in making my snakes go 2, 3, or 4 weeks without feeding, except in the breeding season. Now, what happens when you feed your snakes on a less regular basis is it gives them an opportunity to do what nature intended them to do, and that's to slow down their metabolic rate and to actually start economizing on their metabolic rate. They're not designed to eat on a regular basis. They're opportunist feeders and they will eat whenever they can. But in nature, it's very, very common for there to be seasonal abundance. And snakes for instance, in the dry season, in their tropical environment that they come from, there might not be any baby rats around for weeks at a time. One of the triggers for breeding and getting your females to get into condition and start growing follicles is to bump up the frequency and the amount of food. And if you're feeding every week, you can't do that because they're already being fed every week. So I find if I feed my snakes much less in the off season, when I get ready to breed, I feed heavily. And that is a trigger for your females to actually start producing follicles. It's to do with the changing season, but it's hormonally controlled, and food abundance is one of the biggest triggers in nature to actually trigger that breeding cycle. So I do not feed my snakes on a regular basis. I will feed them every 7, every 10, every 14, every 30 days, and it varies. And I do not feed all my snakes every single time I feed. Some of the snakes get fed one week, some of the snakes get fed another week. I like to mix it up, and I also like to mix up whether they get live or whether they get frozen thawed, whether they get rats, whether they get ASFs. I just mix it up, and I do not geek out about, oh, they've got to get fed today. They have to get fed 10% of their body weight. I don't feed like that. If I'm feeding on a monthly basis, I will give my breeder females a whopping big rat, and they eat it no problem at all, and then go to sleep for a month until they're due to be fed again. Now that's in the off season, and that perfectly mimics actually what snakes do in the wild. There are periods of seasonal abundance when birds are nesting and your hatchlings will climb trees and rob nests because it's a ready food source. When rats are breeding, they don't breed all year round. They will breed during, at the start of the wet season, for instance, when everything is growing. That's when all the mammals will have their babies, and there's a seasonal abundance. Your snakes take advantage of that, and they will breed during that period of abundance. And then for the rest of the year, they minimize their metabolic rates. They will go to sleep for months. They estivate. It's not called hibernation because it's in the tropics. It's always warm. But they definitely can slow down their metabolic rate, and they just go to sleep, and they do not use any energy at all. They don't lose weight. They don't lose condition. And I actually think it's far better for your snakes to feed this way than it is to feed every week. I'm very much against feeding your adult snakes every week. Hatchlings, yes, and they will eat everything that you give them, and their growth rate is directly proportional to the amount that you feed them. But sooner or later, your hatchlings will hit that 1,000-gram wall, that mythical 1,000-gram wall that all breeders complain about. That's simply your snakes saying, okay, enough's enough. I've been on full afterburner for a year. I need to shut down and have a bit of a rest. It's perfectly natural. If you do not feed your snakes that amount of food, you will find they're much less inclined to hit that 1,000-gram wall. My snakes will feed once a month. They'll feed every time I feed them, and they will absolutely smash food. Obviously they will. If you try and feed every week, you'll have picky snakes, and they're not as interested in eating as if you've cut down the frequency. Now, once their hormones get going and they start to build follicles and the males start to get interested in females, then their metabolic rate increases, and then you feed heavily. But the rest of the time, no. Does that help? What's the average temperature in my snake room? Between 28 and 30 during the season, but it varies on a 24-hour basis. It varies next to nothing. My snakes start to show aversion. They start to soak in their water bowls when temperatures get above 31. 28 to 29 is perfect for most of the year. Absolutely perfect. If the temperatures drop much lower than that, then you can start to have digestive issues. Your snakes will start to have runny poos. That's because your temperatures have dropped below optimal. So actually, I find there's a very narrow window for the comfort zone for snakes, and my snake room is at the perfect temperature. So my snakes don't commute to thermoregulate. They don't move on and off hotspots. They're at their perfect temperature all the time. And if you think about where snakes are found in the wild, during the heat of the day, they'll be underground. They'll be hiding where it's nice and cool. So they actually do try to maintain a constant body temperature, and it's their preferred body temperature. I often think that people use hotspots which are too hot. 90 Fahrenheit is too hot. 88 is much better if you're using Fahrenheit. As long as the temperatures are warm enough for your snakes to digest, that's warm enough. They don't actually like it too hot. Okay, again, stuck eye caps. It's always worth checking. Again, because I live in the tropics, I'm going to say that I'm really lucky that my snakes very rarely have any problems at all. And if I check a shed, I even have a green tree python, which gives me a one-piece shed complete with eye caps and a full shed, no problem at all. And green tree pythons are notoriously difficult to get to shed in that way. So yes, always check to see that your snakes have shed their eye caps. Typically, I don't have a problem. You can check the snake itself to see whether there's a stuck eye cap, or you can check the shed. If you have time to check the shed, you should be able to find the eye caps on the shed. But again, if you've got 100 snakes, it's very, very difficult to do that. So typically, I will notice if a snake has an issue when I open the tub rather than when it sheds. Thanks, guys. Okay, here's another one. So am I saying every week up until 1,000 grams, then every 2 weeks? No, again, I'm not that rigorous. I recently went on holiday and I had some hatchlings that had just shed and they'd had 1 or 2 meals. And usually people are desperate to feed their hatchlings every 5 days. And I just left them for 3 weeks. And when I got back, they were perfectly fine. They hadn't died. They hadn't shriveled up. They were not skinny. Were they hungry? Yes, they were. And they ate straight away. So don't be afraid to mix up, even for your hatchlings. Your hatchlings are snakes, just like any other snake, and they have the ability to control their metabolisms. So yes, typically we want our hatchlings to grow fast because we want to get them up to size and we want to breed them. But it does them no harm if you feed them less. They just grow slower. So again, it's up to you. I don't sweat it. I'll feed my hatchlings once a week, once every 10 days. If I can't be bothered to feed them, they get fed once every 10 days. It does them no harm whatsoever. They just grow a little bit slower. The more food in, the quicker they grow. But what I'm saying is that 1,000-gram wall, and it could happen at 800 grams, it could happen at 1,200 grams. But if you've been feeding your snakes weekly on a weekly regime, you've been doing it regularly, sooner or later your snake is going to go, no, I'm switching off the afterburners and I'm not going to eat for 2 or 3 months. Typically, if you feed less than that, your snakes are less inclined to do that. I do feel it's important to allow your snakes a period to digest, all their internal organs to return to normal size, and their metabolic rate to drop. As I say, it's like an aircraft being in afterburner, and they just can't sustain that metabolic rate. It's not good for them. So typically, I will allow my snakes periods where I don't feed them at all, and that slows down their metabolisms. You can see it in the way that the snakes behave, and you can actually get by feeding them a lot less. If you're worried about your cash flow in your collection and worried about hatchlings that are not selling, and you've got racks full of hatchlings, feed them less. It won't do them any harm. They probably won't lose any weight. They will still grow. They'll still be perfectly healthy. So again, I'm going to say that feeding, typically in a captive environment, we feed our snakes too much, too often. Okay, this one. What's a safe breeding weight for first-year breeders? Well, there's a certain age that a snake has to be, and not necessarily a certain weight. I find with my females that it isn't the weight where you start breeding them that I'm concerned about. It's the weight that they end up at after they've laid their eggs. So for instance, if you have a female that's at 1,500 grams and she's in her 3rd year, she's 2 years old, 2.5 years old, and you start pairing at 1,500 grams. If she continues to eat ravenously, she's going to get up to 2 kilos, 2.5 kilos. And when she lays her eggs, she'll drop back to about 1,200, 1,500 grams. But if you have a female that's always been a picky eater, she gets to 1,500 grams and you think, okay, I'm going to pair her now because she's old enough to breed. and you start pairing her, and she stays as a picky eater. She stops eating and she doesn't put weight on, but she decides she's going to lay a clutch of eggs. When she lays a clutch of eggs, a 1,500 gram female will end up skin and bone like a skeleton. So on a case-by-case basis, you have to know your individual snakes. I prefer to start a little bit later, so 3 years and say 1,800 grams. I like my females to get to at least 2 kilos during the peak of their build, and that's easy for me to say because I've got plenty of snakes. So if one snake doesn't breed, it doesn't matter. But for people with smaller collections, I appreciate that they do want to breed as quickly as possible. So the thing that I would say is that we often hear that snakes will breed when they're ready. That is not true. That's a misconception based upon our own perceptions of how mammals breed. So, for instance, in times of low food, mammals, deer, tigers, lions, typically they will either not ovulate and not breed when there's not enough food, or if they have a litter of babies, they will stop lactating and the babies will die, basically sacrificing the babies so that the parents survive to breed when times get better. Snakes, exactly the opposite. Their response to cortisol and stress hormone is to actually try to breed. A snake will breed at the expense of its own life. And the reason they do that is that once the eggs are laid, the snake has no further investment in those babies. And if the mother dies, it doesn't matter. She's laid a clutch of eggs and her babies could potentially survive. So don't be fooled by breeders telling you your snakes will breed when they're ready. Your snakes will breed when they're not ready, and that's down to you. So if you kill them through breeding, that's down to you. That is a potential outcome. It doesn't happen very often because typically a small snake, if it's not ready, will reabsorb the follicles, will not ovulate, and will not go on to lay eggs. The problem occurs in those rare cases where the hormones get the better of them, they're not up to size, they have no chance of surviving the process, but they do actually go on and give us a clutch of eggs, and they die in the process. That's down to us. That's not snakes breeding when they're ready. So that's my opinion on that. I prefer to err on the side of caution, but that's easy for me to say. I have plenty of females to breed, so I don't need to force any of my females to breed if I don't think they're ready for it. So again, I'm not telling anybody how to keep their snakes or when they should and shouldn't breed. Just be aware that that old saying of they'll breed when they're ready is not true. They'll breed when they're not ready, and you can kill them. Erica saying the same thing again. I think case by case basis. I would like to see my females bigger than that, to be honest. She's going to gain, if you start at 1,400 grams, she's not going to make 2 kilos by the time that she lays her clutch of eggs, which again, depending upon how many eggs she lays, 100 grams per egg, she's going to end up. I don't like my snakes to drop below 1,000 grams when they've laid their eggs. If they're below 1,000 grams, they're skin and bone, and recovery takes a lot longer. And it can take more than a year. So sometimes by breeding a female early, yes, she'll get a clutch of eggs. Yes, she'll survive, but then she might not lay again for another 2 or 3 years. Where if you just held off that little bit longer, you can get a decent clutch of eggs and she'll breed again for you next year. Males, not so much a problem. I've bred males younger than that. But again, be aware that males can actually breed themselves to death. Typical males. They have only one thing on their minds and they forget about eating sometimes. Generally not. And the smaller the snake, the fewer the females I tend to put that male to. A big bruiser male, I have no problem putting to multiple females. I also am very conscious of not leaving a male in with a female for too long. If that female shows signs that she doesn't want that male to be around, it's very stressful to keep that male in there. So I tend to pull them early, and my males generally will keep eating. So I'm not worried that it's going to kill them by overbreeding them. So again, it depends how your breeding routine, your protocols, what you personally do and how it works for you. But certainly for females, it's not the weight you start at, it's the weight that they finish at when they lay eggs that's the important thing, because that's what's going to kill them. And you can't predict. If your female's a picky eater, you start early and she continues to be a picky eater, she's not going to make it. If your female is one of those females that never misses a meal, she's absolutely ravenous, yeah, start her early, because she's gonna pack on that weight and she's gonna make it okay, and she will end up a decent weight. It's those few snakes that you start early, you push a little bit, and they refuse to eat for you, but they do go on and give a clutch of eggs. Doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's heartbreaking actually to see a female snake in that condition after she's laid eggs. It's pitiful. And yeah, enough said. Okay, the answer to that simply is yes. Albino and lavender albino are completely different genes. They are not compatible. So in order to get a visual albino, you will need to produce a homozygous for albino. To get a lavender albino, you will need to produce homozygous for lavender albino, and you can produce a combination of the two. So you can have het albino, het lavender. You can have visual albino, het lavender. You can have visual lavender, het albino. Different genes, they reside on a different locus, and you can produce combinations of them. I'm not exactly sure what a lavender albino would look like, but yes, they're different genes, and not a stupid question at all. Do I deworm my snakes at 1 year ever? I tend to treat them not on a regular basis. ARP will do his before he starts breeding, and typically he'll give a dose of fenbendazole to deworm his snakes once a year. I tend not to, and my snakes typically are okay. Another thing that you can do, rather than actually giving medication, because sometimes snakes don't respond very well to medication, their metabolisms are quite slow, and it sometimes takes them a while to actually rid their systems. So again, if your feeding regime, feed them less. Basically, the worms will starve before your snake does. So stop feeding it for a month and then slowly introduce food again. And you'll find that that will often reduce the parasite load in your snake. You don't need to medicate. You can do it through your feeding regime. Ambient in my snake room, 28 to 30 degrees. Any lower than that, and I start to have digestive issues. Any higher than that, and my snakes start to show avoidance, bowl wrapping, soaking, moving away from the outside walls where it's warm. So they prefer to be in the range 28 to 30. I do find that the low end of the range, about 28, is good for the bulk of the year. But during the breeding season, when I want my snakes to start ovulating, typically that gets in sync with the seasons, and the snake room is rising in temperature anyway. But all my snakes start to ovulate at about 30 degrees centigrade. So it's very subtle. The difference in temperatures is very, very small, and they're very sensitive to it. So 28 to 30, but when I want my snakes to ovulate, it's up at the 30. No, no, absolutely not. Let me answer this in a bit more depth. I put my males in with the females about once a month. There is no point in putting them in any more frequently than that. Weekly is way too much, and it's unnecessary. Puts too much stress on the males, also puts too much stress on the females. Generally, when females and males are together, they don't like it. They don't like the presence of each other, and it's very stressful. So in order for them to mate successfully, your male has to go in, dominate that female, do the business, and get out again. And in the wild, the female would kick him out. In captivity in our tubs, they can't. We trap them in the tubs. So I will check, and I've done videos on this for you guys. You might want to double check that, but there's a lot of body language that tells you how the pairing is going to go. One of those is I introduce my males by letting them go in the tub themselves. And if they're hot to trot and go straight in the tub, I know they're hot to trot. Sometimes the male is a bit more reluctant to go into the tub, in which case I either won't put him in or I will pay particular attention to that male. Because if the female starts to pin him down or push him to the back of the tub, that's her saying, I do not want you in here. I do not want to mate with you. Go away. And she will dominate that male and pin him to the tub. If you leave the male in, particularly if you leave him for a week, he's going to stop it. He's going to be so stressed when he comes out of there because he's trapped and can't get away. He will stop eating and he'll be very reluctant to breed the next time. So I'm very, very careful about how often and for how long I pair my males. If a male is hot to trot, he goes in, I get a good lock, and it's the very next morning, they've locked, I've seen the lock, and he's unlocked, I'll take him out straight away. One day. That's all it takes. In fact, it takes a lot less than 1 day. It only takes about 30 seconds. But yes, I do not leave them together for a week, and I certainly do not leave them together for a week without checking to see how they're progressing. 3 days maximum. Even if they're locked and they've been locked for 2 days, as soon as that male unlocks, I will pull him out. Females do not like males to be around. They want one thing and one thing only, and that's to fertilize their eggs and get the male out. So no, I pair once a month, and I pair for 1 day, 2 day, or 3 days, and then I will pull that male out. If he's going to multiple females, I tend to do it on a weekly basis. So I'll pull him out, I'll rest him at least a day if he's got a lot of females to go to, but typically for the rest of the week. And I will try and feed him, and then he'll go to the next female the following week. So a lot less frequently than you're suggesting here. I don't think it's necessary to pair that often. Snakes can store sperm, and it's actually a very stressful exercise for them. And if you leave them in too long and you miss the signs that the female is getting a bit pissed off with the male, you can overstress both of them and not be as successful as you would be if you did it less frequently. Just going through the comments here. All right, guys, I have an admission to make here. I have a reptile expo to go to in Malacca, which is about 2 hours away. And I'm going to be going to ARP to pick up Arwen. And we're going down there together because he's actually sponsoring some of the prizes. So I'm going to have to cut this short. Thank you all for your attendance here. I will actually go through all these comments. I'll do another live stream because I'm actually quite enjoying this. I'm enjoying the interaction. Let me just answer Bold Coast Exotics there. I've been keeping my ambient at 80, 26. Is that detrimental? If temperatures drop below about 26, your main concern there is digestion. At a time when you want your snakes to be eating heavily because they're growing follicles, they're going to start to have a little bit of trouble digesting. So I would say during the breeding season, you want to be a little bit warmer than 26. You want to be up around 28 or 29 so that they're digesting properly. 26 is a little bit cool. You could probably get away with it, particularly if you feed less frequently. But as I say, if the objective here is breeding, you want them to be digesting at their optimal. So I would suggest that 28 or 29 is a better temperature, but not too hot. Don't take it up to 31 because they don't like it too hot either. So yeah, I think 26 for me, that would be on the cool side. My snake room never gets that cold. 28 is about as cold as it ever gets. All right, guys, so I'm going to cut this short now. I will go through all the comments and I'll post another date for a live stream because, as I say, I have enjoyed this. Sorry if I didn't get all your questions. I will try and get to them either in the future or on a future live stream. T&J Reptiles, hi mate, how are you too? I'm just about to cut this short. Sorry. I have to go to a reptile expo now, but I'll be doing this again. And most of you guys here, I think, are from the States. So I'm going to have to try and organize my time to be able to do one for the UK as well, so that our UK guys can jump on. But thank you all for joining this live stream. The technology actually worked. I've surprised myself. So since it works and it is actually quite easy to do, I'll do it again. So fantastic, guys. Thank you all, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye.